Millionaire finds an abandoned child with an old photo. The image shows a portrait of himself when he was young. An unexplainable connection between the child and the past emerges. Curiosity leads him to revelations that could change his life forever. The sun was beginning to set over Chicago when William Thompson left the lobby of the Ritz-Carlton, where he had just attended another charity event for his foundation. At 52, he carried himself with the elegant poise of someone who had always known how to occupy positions of power, though his brown eyes conveyed a serenity that few billionaires could maintain. His graying temples only added an air of distinction to his appearance, and his custom Italian suit complemented the image of the successful philanthropist everyone knew. As he walked toward his armored Mercedes, William was still smiling, mentally reviewing the numbers presented during the event. His foundation had surpassed all its goals from the previous year, benefiting over 50,000 children through educational programs. He was a fulfilled man, having transformed the business empire inherited from his father into a true instrument of social change. That's when he saw her. The girl couldn't have been more than 8 years old. She was standing near one of the hotel's columns, wearing a simple but clean dress and holding something in her small hands. What caught William's attention, however, wasn't her unexpected presence in that setting, but the way she looked at him, a deep, familiar gaze that made him stop instantly. "Are you lost?" William asked, gesturing for his driver and security to wait. The girl didn't answer. Instead, she extended what she was holding in her hands, an old photograph yellowed with age. William took it, more out of reflex than conscious choice, and felt the world spin around him. In the image, clearly faded but still sharp, was himself, about 30 years younger, in a place he couldn't immediately recognize. He was wearing a simple white shirt and smiling at the camera with a carefree expression he hadn't seen on his own face in a long time. Where did you get this?" His voice came out shakier than he would have liked. "Don't you remember?" The girl finally spoke, her soft voice carrying a tone of disappointment that struck him like an arrow. William looked at the photo, again, then at the girl and then at his security guard, who was already approaching with a concerned expression. With a gesture, he asked him to stay back. "What's your name?" He tried again, crouching down to her level. "Eleanor," she replied simply, her honey-colored eyes never leaving his. "And your parents, Eleanor? Where are they?" The girl shrugged, a gesture so adult in such a small body that it made William's chest tighten. "I don't know. I came here just to deliver the photo to you," she said. William looked around, searching for someone who might be watching the scene, some adult, responsible for the child, but the activity in front of the hotel was minimal at that hour. "You can't stay here alone," he said, noticing that the sun had almost disappeared on the horizon. "Let me help. We can look for your parents or—" "No need," Eleanor interrupted him, taking a small step back. "I just needed to be sure." "Sure? Of what?" "That you were really the man in the photo." She smiled for the first time, a smile that triggered a strange sense of déjà vu in William. "Now I know it's you." Before he could react, Eleanor turned and started running toward the street. William quickly stood up, shouting to his security, "Charles, catch her!" But by the time Charles reached the corner, Eleanor had vanished, as if she had never been there. William remained still, the photograph still trembling slightly in his hands. He looked at the image again, flipping it over this time. On the back, there was a single line written in handwriting he didn't recognize. "Some truths need time to be revealed." That night, sitting in his office in the penthouse of Murrumbee, William couldn't take his eyes off the photograph. The place in the background continued to elude his memory, like a dream that fades upon waking. He picked up his phone and called Richard, his best friend and lawyer for over 30 years. "I need you to analyze a photo," he said as soon as Richard answered. "Now." "William, it's almost 10 at night." "It's important," he interrupted, his voice leaving no room for discussion. "And I need you to find out everything you can about a child. A girl named Eleanor." There was a moment of silence on the other end of the line before Richard responded, "Is something wrong?" William looked once more at the photograph, at his own young face smiling back at him, and felt a chill run down his spine. "I don't know yet," he answered honestly. but I intend to find out." The next morning, William was already in his office when Richard arrived carrying a folder and a concerned expression on his face. The lawyer, who had shared practically his entire professional history with William, rarely saw him so anxious. "So?" William asked as soon as Richard sat down. "The photo is authentic," Richard replied, placing a report on the table. "I contacted one of the best photography experts in the country. He analyzed it overnight. There are no signs of digital or chemical manipulation. The print is approximately 30 years old, based on the type of paper and photographic process used." William picked up the report, but his eyes soon returned to Richard. "What about the girl?" Richard shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "It's more complicated. Without a last name or more information, it's like looking for a needle in a haystack. We would need more details." "There has to be a record somewhere," William insisted, standing up to pace around the office. "A child doesn't just appear out of nowhere with a photo of me from 30 years ago." "William," Richard spoke cautiously, "perhaps we should consider other aspects of this situation. You're a public figure. This could be—" "No," William interrupted him. "You didn't see the look in her eyes, Richard. It wasn't a setup. There was something familiar." Richard sighed, taking off his glasses to clean them, a habit William knew well, always present when his friend was about to say something difficult. "Do you remember where this photo was taken?" William stopped pacing, looking back at the image. "Not exactly. The setting seems familiar, but it's like the memory is blurry." "And that doesn't worry you?" Richard put his glasses back on. "You've always had an extraordinary memory for business, dates, places. How can you not remember where you were when this photo was taken?" The question hit William like a punch to the gut. Richard was right. His memory had always been one of his strengths. As a businessman and philanthropist, he took pride in his ability to recall details, names, entire conversations from years ago. But that photo, it was as if there was a fog in his mind every time he tried to focus on it. "I'll go to the Foundation's archives," William decided suddenly. "Maybe there's something there that can help us identify the location." "William," Richard began, but he was interrupted by the ringing of the phone on the desk. It was Charles, the security guard. "Mr. Thompson, there's a lady here at the reception. She says she knows the girl from yesterday." William and Richard exchanged glances. "Send her up," William ordered, feeling his heart race. Minutes later, a woman of about 70 entered the office. She introduced herself as Mrs. Celeste, and something in her eyes reminded him of Eleanor. "You shouldn't have let her run away," were her first words, spoken with a mix of reproach and sadness. "Do you know who that girl is?" William asked, offering the woman a chair. "Eleanor is special," Mrs. Celeste replied, sitting down carefully. "She has a gift for finding people who need to be found." Richard snorted softly beside him, but William ignored him. "What exactly does that mean?" "It means she came to you for a reason," the woman continued, pulling something from her bag. It was an old, slightly crumpled manila envelope. "And this belongs to you." William took the envelope with trembling hands. Inside, there were more old photographs, all seemingly from the same era as the first one. In one of them, he was in the same unknown place, but he wasn't alone. There was a woman beside him, her face partially covered by a straw hat, and they seemed to be laughing about something. "Who is she?" he asked, showing the photo. "You need to remember on your own," Mrs. Celeste replied, standing up. "Some memories can't simply be told. They need to be rediscovered." "Wait," William called as she headed for the door. "How can I find Eleanor again?" Mrs. Celeste smiled, the same enigmatic smile he had seen on the girl's face. "You don't need to find her. She'll appear when the time is right. But I suggest you start your search with the place in the photos. Riverside Village still exists, you know." With those words, she left, leaving William and Richard in stunned silence. It was Richard who finally broke it. Riverside Village. Why does that name sound familiar? William was already at his computer, typing frantically. "Because it's where we built our first social project," he replied, his eyes fixed on the screen. 30 years ago. William's car wound its way along the dirt road leading to Riverside Village, kicking up a cloud of red dust in its wake. Richard, sitting beside him, kept his eyes glued to his tablet, reviewing old documents they had found in the Foundation's archives. "I still can't believe you decided to come personally," Richard commented, adjusting his glasses. "We could have sent someone to investigate." William kept his eyes on the road. "I need to see this place with my own eyes, Richard. Ever since Mrs. Celeste mentioned the name, I've been having flashbacks, fragments of memories that don't make sense." The lawyer closed the tablet, turning to his friend. "What kind of fragments?" "Laughter," William replied after a moment of hesitation. "The sound of running water, the scent of jasmine, they're like loose pieces of a puzzle I can't put together." Finally, after another 20 minutes of driving, they spotted the faded sign, "Welcome to Riverside Village." The small town in the countryside of Chicago seemed to have stopped in time. The simple houses, painted in bright colors, lined the main street, and the locals looked curiously at the luxurious car that stood out from the local scenery. William parked in front of a small cafe, the only business that seemed open at that time of the morning. An elderly woman with white hair was sweeping the sidewalk and looked up as they stepped out of the car. For a moment, she stood still, the broom suspended in mid-air. "My goodness," she murmured, placing a hand on her chest. "You've come back." William and Richard exchanged glances. "Do you know me?" William asked, stepping closer. "How could I not?" she replied, still sounding astonished. "You look just like your father when he first came here, only younger than he was at the time, of course." "My father?" William felt his heart race. "You knew my father." "Mrs. Zephyr!" A man's voice called from inside the cafe. A man around 80 years old appeared at the door, leaning on a cane. His eyes widened as he saw William. "It can't be—" "It's August's son, Mr. Joseph," Mrs. Zephyr explained. "Remember him? The young man who stayed here that summer?" "Come in," Mr. Joseph interrupted them, making an urgent gesture with his free hand. "There's a lot we need to talk about." The interior of the cafe was simple yet cozy, with old wooden tables and black and white photographs on the walls. Mr. Joseph led them to a table at the back, away from the windows, while Mrs. Zephyr served coffee in mismatched porcelain cups. "Your father never told you about Riverside Village?" Mr. Joseph asked as soon as they sat down. William shook his head. "I only knew we had a social project here 30 years ago. It was our first in the region." The old man let out a dry laugh. "Social project? Is that what they call it now?" He exchanged a meaningful look with Mrs. Zephyr. "Your father came here long before you were born, young man. And he returned several times after that. The last time was when you were in your early 20s. William took the photograph from his pocket, the one Eleanor had given him, and placed it on the table. "Is this from around that time?" Mrs. Zephyr picked up the photo with trembling hands. "Ah, yes. It was the summer of 1994. You were always with her back then." "With who?" William asked, his voice almost a whisper. Before Mrs. Zephyr could answer, the cafe door opened, and a gust of wind made the cups clink. Eleanor stood at the entrance, wearing the same simple dress as the day before. "Not yet," the girl said in her soft voice. "He needs to remember on his own." Mr. Joseph and Mrs. Zephyr immediately fell silent, as if the child's presence exerted some kind of power over them. Eleanor walked to the table, her footsteps echoing in the silence that had settled. "Did you bring the other photos?" asked William. He nodded, pulling out the brown envelope that Mrs. Celeste had given him. Eleanor took it and began spreading the photographs on the table, arranging them in a pattern that only she seemed to understand. "Each image is a door," she explained, pointing to different photos. "But you're looking for the wrong key." "What key should I be looking for?" William asked, leaning forward. Eleanor smiled her enigmatic smile. "The waterfall," she replied simply. "Start with the waterfall." That's where it all began and ended. Richard, who had remained silent while observing the scene, finally spoke up. "What waterfall?" "Mirror Falls," Mr. Joseph answered. "It's about 2 kilometers from here, up the mountain. That's where the young people used to meet back in the day." William closed his eyes, and for a moment, the sound of running water in his memory became clearer. He could smell the wet earth, hear distant laughter, feel the touch of a hand on his. When he opened his eyes, Eleanor had disappeared again. In the place where she had been on the table, there was a single photo he didn't remember seeing before. An image of a waterfall surrounded by rocks, with a female figure standing with her back turned, her long black hair swaying in the wind. Richard watched his friend with concern as they climbed the trail toward Mirror Falls. William had insisted on going immediately, ignoring warnings about the steep terrain and the midday heat. Mr. Joseph had drawn a rudimentary map on a napkin from the cafe, marking the landmarks with his shaky handwriting. "William," Richard called, panting from the climb. "We need to talk about all of this situation, this girl. None of it makes sense." William stopped for a moment, wiping the sweat from his forehead with the sleeve of his dress shirt, which was now completely wrinkled. "What exactly doesn't make sense, Richard? The fact that I don't remember being here? Or the fact that apparently my father had some kind of history with this place that he never told me about? All of that," Richard replied, stepping closer, "and especially the fact that a mysterious child shows up with old photos of you, disappears, and then reappears as a ghost. And now we're following her clues as if..." "As if what?" William interrupted, his voice tinged with irritation. "As if she knew more about your life than you do." The silence that followed was filled only by the distant sound of running water and the occasional chirping of birds. William took a deep breath, trying to organize his thoughts. "Remember when we started the foundation?" he finally asked. "It was my father's idea. He insisted that our first project should be here in Riverside Village. At the time, I thought it was just because it was an underprivileged area, but now..." "Now what?" "Now I realize there was something more. The way he talked about this place, how he insisted that I personally oversee the project. Richard, I think I came here back then for a specific reason, and for some reason, I blocked those memories." They continued walking in silence for a few more minutes until the sound of the waterfall grew louder. As they rounded the last bend in the trail, they were met with the full grandeur of Mirror Falls. The crystal-clear water cascaded from a height of about 20 meters, forming a natural pool surrounded by smooth, dark rocks. William felt his legs weaken. The sight was exactly like in the photograph, but more than that, it was familiar in a visceral way, as if every detail of the landscape was etched deep within his memory. "The Kissing Rock," he murmured, his eyes fixed on a particular rock formation to the right of the waterfall. "What?" Richard asked, but William was already moving toward the rock. It was a peculiar formation, slightly tilted over the natural pool, creating a small natural shelter. William approached as if in a trance, his fingers touching the cold surface of the stone. A flash of memory hit him. Laughter, the touch of soft lips, the scent of jasmine stronger than ever. "This is where," he said, his voice choked. "We used to meet here." "We who, William?" Before he could respond, a movement on the opposite bank of the natural pool caught his attention. Eleanor was there, watching them with her piercing eyes. Beside her for the first time was someone else, Mrs. Celeste. "Some stories need to be remembered in the right order." Mrs. Celeste's voice echoed over the sound of the water. "There are more places you need to visit before you reach the truth." "What places?" William shouted back, but his voice was almost swallowed by the sound of the waterfall. Eleanor raised her hand, pointing to something behind him. William turned and noticed, partially hidden by the vegetation, a small stone structure. It appeared to be an old chapel, its walls covered in moss and vines. "The Chapel of St. Michael," Richard read from his tablet, consulting the old documents. According to these records, it was restored as part of the Foundation's social project in 1994. When William looked back across the waterfall, Eleanor and Mrs. Celeste had disappeared. However, something glimmered in the spot where they had been. Ignoring Richard's protests, he circled the natural pool, his dress shoes slipping on the wet stones. There, on a flat stone, was an old key, seemingly made of bronze, with a small bell hanging from its keychain. The gentle tinkling of the bell in the wind brought with it another wave of memories. The sound of religious music, the smell of burning candles, voices whispering promises on a summer afternoon. The key was heavy in William's hands, the small bell tinkling softly as he approached the chapel. The vines had taken over most of the structure, but it was still possible to make out the beautiful stained glass windows, though covered in decades of dust. "This is insane," Richard murmured, following his friend. "We don't know what could be inside after so many years." William stopped in front of the old wooden door. "We restored this place, Richard. It was part of the project." Yes, 30 years ago. Look at the state of it now. But William was already inserting the key into the lock. To his surprise, it turned smoothly, as if it had been used recently. The door creaked open, revealing an interior partially illuminated by the light filtering through the stained glass. The smell of recently extinguished candles lingered in the air, contradicting the apparent abandonment of the place. The wooden pews, though dusty, were perfectly aligned. At the altar, an arrangement of fresh flowers surprised the two men. "Someone has been taking care of this place," Richard observed, running his finger along one of the pews and noticing that the layer of dust was thinner than he expected. William walked down the central aisle, his footsteps echoing in the silence. Each step brought fragments of memories, organ music, voices singing, the rustle of a dress. "There," he pointed to a side door, almost hidden behind the altar. "The sacristy." Once again, the key fit perfectly in the lock. The small room was surprisingly organized, with antique cabinets lining the walls and a solid wood table in the center. On the table, an open registry book caught William's attention. "It's a wedding book," he said, moving closer. The yellowed pages contained meticulous records of ceremonies performed over the years. His fingers slid across the pages until they stopped at a specific date, January 15th, 1994. "There's something here," Richard noticed, pointing to an envelope that was marking that particular page. William picked up the envelope with trembling hands. Inside was a photograph that made his heart stop for a moment. Himself, much younger, wearing a light suit next to a woman in a simple white dress. They were standing before the chapel altar, their hands joined, radiant smiles on their faces. "My God," Richard whispered, looking over his friend's shoulder. "William, did you get married here?" Before William could answer, the sound of footsteps caught their attention. At the sacristy door, Mr. Joseph watched them with a serious expression. "I knew you'd come back here today," the elderly man said, entering the room with slow steps. "That's why I left the envelope." "You knew?" William asked, his voice trembling. "You knew all along?" "Just like everyone in the village," Mr. Joseph replied, sitting in a nearby chair. "It was one of the most beautiful days we've ever seen here, the wedding of the young businessman to the professor's daughter." "The professor's daughter?" Richard interjected. "Professor Michael," Mr. Joseph explained, "the man who gave this chapel its name. He was the village's teacher, respected by everyone, and Claire was his only daughter." The name struck William like a bolt of lightning. Claire. Suddenly, the scent of jasmine in his memories had a name, a face, a story. But that's impossible," he stammered, staggering until he found support on the table. I would remember if—" "You do remember," a child's voice sounded from the doorway. Eleanor was there, Mrs. Celeste right behind her. "You just need to want to remember." The girl approached, pulling something from the pocket of her dress, a thin chain with a small bell, identical to the one on the key. "It was hers," Eleanor said softly, extending the chain to William. "She always said the sound of the bell was like music for the soul." William took the chain, and the moment the metal touched his skin, a flood of memories overwhelmed him. Claire ringing the bell as she ran along the trail to the waterfall, the crystalline sound of her laughter mixing with the chime of the metal. The two of them sitting on the chapel steps making plans for the future, Professor Michael blessing their union. "Where—" William tried to speak, his voice faltering. "Where is Claire now?" A heavy silence fell over the sacristy. It was Mrs. Celeste who finally answered, her voice laden with an ancient sadness. "That's the question you should have asked 30 years ago, my son." The group gathered in Mr. Joseph's cafe, which had closed its doors to regular customers. The afternoon sun lazily streamed through the windows as Mrs. Zephyr silently served tea. William held the chain with the bell in one hand and the wedding photo in the other, his eyes lost in a distant point. "It was your father," Mr. Joseph began, his voice breaking the heavy silence. August Thompson never approved of the relationship. A powerful man like him couldn't accept that his only son and heir would marry a country teacher. Richard, who had remained extraordinarily quiet since the discovery in the chapel, finally spoke up. But how is it possible that William doesn't remember any of this? Power and money can buy many things, Mrs. Celeste replied bitterly. Even forgetfulness when you know the right people. William raised his eyes, meeting Eleanor's gaze, who was sitting quietly in a corner. The girl watched him with a mix of sadness and anticipation. "What happened after the wedding?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "You and Claire lived here for almost 6 months, Mrs. Zephyr answered, sitting down with them. "They were the happiest months we had ever seen. Claire taught at the local school. You helped Professor Michael with community projects. You had so many plans. And then your father showed up," Mr. Joseph continued, "with lawyers, documents, threats. He said he would ruin Professor Michael's reputation, shut down the school, and destroy everyone's lives in the village if you didn't return to Chicago." William closed his eyes, fragments of memory emerging like pieces of a puzzle, shouting, papers being signed, his father's face red with anger, Claire crying. I left," he asked, though he already knew the answer. "Not immediately," Mrs. Celeste replied. "You fought at first, but August was persistent. He started sending people doctors who said you needed treatment for your rebellious behavior. And then, one day, you just changed." "The doctors came every week," Mr. Joseph added, "always with more medication, more therapies. Claire begged you to stop, said they were changing you, that you weren't the same anymore. But you insisted that your father only wanted what was best for you." "And her?" William asked, his voice almost a whisper. "What happened to Claire?" A heavy silence fell over the cafe. It was Eleanor who answered, her childlike voice carrying an ancient wisdom. She waited. "Even after you left, even after your father's lawyers showed up with annulment papers, even after the foundation started the social project that was actually a way to monitor the village. She waited." William looked again at the wedding photo, at the radiant smile on Claire's face, at the way their hands intertwined. How could he have forgotten something so fundamental? "The medications, the therapies," Richard murmured, understanding. "They erased your memories. But why did I never know about this? I was your friend even back then." "You were in Europe that year, Richard," Mr. Joseph replied. "When you returned, William was already a different person, and there were explicit orders from August Thompson that no one should ever mention Riverside. Village or Claire? And now," William asked, looking at Eleanor, "why now? Why did you bring me back?" The girl stood up, approaching him with deliberate steps. Her eyes, William realized with a pang in his heart, were identical to Claire's in the photograph. "Because some truths cannot stay buried forever," she replied, simply. "And because Claire left a letter for you before she went abroad, a letter that was only to be delivered when you were ready to remember." Eleanor pulled a yellowed envelope from the pocket of her dress, the paper visibly handled with care over the years. On the front, in the delicate handwriting William now recognized, it read, "For when you remember us." The sun was already setting when William finally found the courage to open the letter. He had asked to be alone in the chapel, where the golden light of dusk filtered through the stained glass, creating a colorful mosaic on the stone floor. With trembling fingers, he unfolded the yellowed pages, immediately recognizing Claire's elegant handwriting. "My dear William, if you are reading this letter, it means you have finally broken through the barriers they built in your mind. It means you remember us, our story, our love that should have been forever. I do not blame you for leaving. I understand. Now that you are also a victim of the circumstances, the manipulations, the power your father wielded over everyone around you. For a long time, I wondered if our love hadn't been strong enough to overcome all of this. But then I understood that it wasn't a matter of strength. It was a matter of choice, and your choice was taken from you. Perhaps you wonder why I waited so long to bring this truth to you. The answer is simple. You needed to be ready. Your father was a powerful and determined man, and as long as he lived, any attempt to bring you back to the truth would be smothered with more treatments, more lies, more manipulations. There is so much I need to tell you, so much you need to know. But some truths are like seeds. They need the right moment to sprout, and that moment has come, not just for you, but for all of us." Eleanor must have found you by now. She has this special gift of knowing exactly when and where she needs to be. It's as if she can read the invisible lines that connect people, places, memories. Perhaps you've already noticed the resemblance in her eyes. William stopped reading, his heart beating unevenly. He went back a few paragraphs, reread the words, trying to absorb their full meaning. The light through the stained glass windows shifted, casting new colors onto the paper. When I found out I was pregnant, you had already been gone for 2 weeks. I tried to tell you, but your security wouldn't let me near. The letters I sent came back unopened. The phone calls were blocked. Your father had built an impenetrable wall around you. I left for Portugal weeks later, accepting an offer to teach at a university in Lisbon. It wasn't an escape. It was a way to protect what we had built, to preserve what remained of our love. Eleanor was born on a spring morning, so much like you that sometimes it hurt to look at her. I raised our daughter by telling her stories about you, not the businessman who appeared in the newspapers, but the man I fell in love with. Kind, dreamy, full of plans to make the world a better place. I showed her the photos I kept, taught her the songs we used to sing together, took her to the places in Portugal you always said you wanted to visit. She grew up knowing that her father hadn't abandoned us by choice, that there was a bigger story behind our separation. And as she grew, her special gift began to manifest. She started having dreams about Riverside Village, about the chapel, about you. It was she who said a few months ago that it was time for you to know the truth. We returned to Brazil when we learned of your father's passing. Eleanor insisted that we needed to be here, that you would finally be ready to remember. She is so certain about things. Sometimes it scares me how much she knows. William, I'm not writing this letter to demand the time we lost or to cause more pain. I'm writing because you deserve to know the truth. You deserve to meet your daughter. You deserve the chance to choose your own path, this time free from the manipulation and control that stole so many years from our lives. I'll be at the place where it all began when you're ready. Eleanor will know the exact moment. She always does. With love, Claire. William let the pages fall into his lap, silent tears streaming down his face. The memories now flowed freely. The first meeting with Claire at the waterfall, the afternoon studying together in the village library, the plans. They made for the future, the moment he realized he loved her more than anything in the world. A movement at the chapel door caught his attention. Eleanor, his daughter he now knew for certain, was standing there watching him with those eyes that mirrored his own. She's waiting, Eleanor said softly, at the kissing stone. William stood up, carefully tucking the letter into his pocket. 30 years of suppressed memories, of denied love, of buried truths, all leading to this moment. Will you be okay? He asked Eleanor, stopping beside her. The girl smiled, the same smile he now recognized from the mirror. I will. Everything will be okay now. The path to the waterfall felt different now. Every rock, every tree, every bend in the trail carried a memory that William could finally access. There was the tree where he had carved their initials alongside Claire's. Further ahead, the fallen trunk where they used to sit and watch the sunset. And soon after, the clearing where they had danced in the rain on a summer afternoon. Richard had insisted on coming with him, but William needed to walk this path alone. His friend waited at the cafe with Mr. Joseph and Mrs. Zephyr, all respecting the intimacy of this moment. The sound of the waterfall grew louder with each step, mingling with the rapid beating of his heart. The last bend in the trail approached, and with it the certainty that his life would never be the same. That's when he caught the scent, jasmine, soft but unmistakable, carried by the afternoon breeze. His steps faltered for a moment, a wave of emotions threatening to break down the last defenses he still held. And then he saw her. Claire was sitting on the kissing rock, just like so many times in the past. Her hair still black, but now with a few silver strands danced in the wind. She was looking at the waterfall, but William knew she had noticed his presence. You always loved this place, she said without turning, her voice carrying the same melodious tone that filled his newly awakened memories. Claire, he managed to say, his own voice choked with emotion. She finally turned, and William felt the world stop. The years had been kind to Claire. Her face still held the same sweetness that had captivated him 3 decades ago, now framed by soft lines that only added character to her beauty. "Do you remember the first time we met here?" she asked, a small smile playing on her lips. "You were collecting water samples for a school project," William replied automatically, the memory as clear now as if it had happened yesterday. "I had come to survey the land for the Foundation's social project. You told me that development without environmental awareness was like building a castle on sand." Claire laughed softly. "And you cancelled all your appointments that week to help me with the sample collection." "My father was furious," William added, taking a step toward her. "He said I was wasting my time with, what did he call it? Oh yes, insignificant projects of a small-town teacher. Your father had very strong opinions about what mattered in life," Claire remarked, her tone now more serious. "Strong enough to erase memories and rewrite stories." William was now just a few steps away from her. "Why didn't you come to me after he was gone?" "That wasn't how it was supposed to happen," she replied, standing up. "You needed to find your way back on your own. Eleanor understood that even before I did." "Our daughter," William whispered, the reality of those words still surprising him. "How is she?" "Is it special?" Claire completed. "It always has been. Since she was little, she had this connection with people, with places, with time, as if she could see beyond the veil that separates the present from the past, truth from lies. They were face to face now, separated only by inches of air heavy with history. "Forgive me," William asked, his voice almost a whisper, "for not being strong enough, for letting myself be manipulated, for losing so many years." Claire raised, her hand gently touching his face. Her touch was exactly as he remembered, gentle, warm, like a ray of sunshine after a long night. "There's nothing to forgive," she replied. "You were a victim too. And now we have the chance to write a new chapter. How can we make up for so much lost time?" Claire smiled, pulling something from her pocket, a small bell, identical to the one Eleanor carried. "One moment at a time," she answered, making the bell chime softly, "like we always have." The crystalline sound echoed through the falls, blending with the noise of the water, the wind in the trees, and the synchronized beats of their hearts. And there, in the same place where their story had begun 30 years earlier, William and Claire started their journey of rediscovery. Mr. Joseph's cafe had turned into a sort of makeshift headquarters. William, Claire, and Eleanor occupied a table in the back, untouched cups of hot chocolate in front of them, while Richard organized documents at a nearby table. The lawyer alternated glances between his tablet and the trio, still trying to process everything he had discovered in the last few hours. "So you're a university professor in Lisbon?" William asked Claire, his eyes rarely leaving her face, as if he feared she might disappear at any moment. "Was," Claire corrected with a gentle smile. "I took a leave at the beginning of the year when Eleanor said we needed to return to Brazil." Eleanor, sitting between the two, played with her bell, creating a soft, intermittent melody that seemed to cradle the conversation. "How did you know?" William asked his daughter. "How did you know it was the right time?" The girl shrugged, a gesture that reminded him so much of Claire and himself. "It's like when you know it's going to rain before you see the clouds, or when you wake up seconds before the alarm goes off. I just know." "She's always been like this," Claire explained, running her hand through her daughter's hair. "When she was younger, she would draw places she had never been to, including the chapel and the waterfall. She told stories about a man who helped people, even though she had never seen you in the newspapers or on TV." Richard approached the table carrying a folder. "Sorry to interrupt, but I think you need to see this." He placed some documents on the table. "I've been reviewing the Foundation's records. The social project in Riverside Village. It wasn't exactly what we thought." William picked up the papers, Claire leaning in to read along with him. They were financial reports, contracts, internal memos, all dated 1994. "My father," William began, his voice trembling slightly. "He didn't create the project to help the village. It was a front to keep people here, watching, reporting, controlling the information. Mr. Joseph and Mrs. Zephyr were the only ones who didn't accept money from the Foundation," Claire commented. That's why the cafe was always a safe place for us. And that's why they were able to keep the photos and the letter all these years, Eleanor added, surprising the adults with her insight. William closed his eyes for a moment, painful memories surfacing. The doctors who came to visit me, the medications. It was all part of his plan. Claire covered William's hand with hers. Your father was a man who believed the ends justified the means. In his mind, he was protecting you. Protecting me? William laughed without humor. He destroyed our life together, made me forget my own marriage, my own daughter. Eleanor finished, her voice soft but firm. But now you remember, and that's what matters. A contemplative silence fell over the group, broken only by the gentle tinkling of Eleanor's bell. It was Richard who finally spoke. What do you plan to do now? It was the question that had been hanging in the air since the reunion at Mirror Falls. Claire and William exchanged glances, years of separation and unspoken feelings floating between them. I can't just go back to Lisbon, Claire said, not now. And I can't ask you to abandon your life there, William replied. Eleanor rolled her eyes in a surprisingly teenage manner for someone so young. Adults always complicate simple things, she commented, making Richard stifle a laugh. And what would be simple in your opinion? Claire asked, a playful smile on her lips. Stay where the heart is, Eleanor replied, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world, and build from there. William looked at his daughter with admiration. In a few words, she had cut through all the complications the adults were creating. The foundation has projects in Portugal, he said slowly, an idea beginning to form. We could expand our work there, and here we could turn Riverside Village into what it was always meant to be, a place of true social transformation. And the chapel? Eleanor asked, her eyes shining. We can restore it properly this time, Claire suggested. Turn it into a cultural center for the community. It was my father's dream. Grandpa Michael's, Eleanor corrected, making William feel a tightness in his chest upon hearing the word grandpa. Richard cleared his throat, drawing everyone's attention. Technically, the chapel still belongs to the foundation, but as president, William can easily transfer it to a community project. Starting over, William murmured, squeezing Claire's hand. Not as atonement for the past, but as a promise for the future. And this time, Claire added, no secrets, no manipulations, just the truth. Eleanor smiled, making her bell chime once more. The crystalline sound seemed to seal that moment, that promise of a new beginning. Through one of the cafe windows, the afternoon sun illuminated the scene, creating a picture that seemed almost magical. A family reunited after 30 years, ready to write a new chapter in their story. The news of Claire and Eleanor's return to Riverside Village spread quickly through the small community. Within days, Mr. Joseph's cafe had become an even busier meeting spot, with former residents showing up to welcome them and share stories. From the past, William had decided to stay in the village for a few weeks, managing the foundation remotely while helping with the chapel restoration plans. Richard occasionally returned to Chicago to handle the legal aspects of the changes they were planning, but he always came back with new documents and ideas for the project. On a particularly pleasant morning, William watched Eleanor and Claire organizing books in the village's old library, which was attached to the school where Claire had taught so many years ago. Their daughter had inherited her mother's love for books and education, and seeing the two of them together made his heart overflow with emotion. She has her way of leading, Claire remarked, noticing how Eleanor naturally directed the other young people helping with the organization. She always knows exactly what needs to be done. And her compassion, William replied, the way she cares for everyone around her. Claire smiled, adjusting some books on a shelf. Do you know what she told me yesterday, that we could turn the library into a storytelling space? Not just from the books, she explained, but from the people in the village too. So the stories don't get lost again. William felt a lump in his throat. It was exactly the kind of project he and Claire had dreamed of together, 3 decades ago. Eleanor, in some way, was helping to fulfill the dreams her parents had been forced to abandon. Dad! Eleanor called from one of the tables, where she was organizing old photographs that the residents had donated to the village's historical archive. Look what I found, William and Claire approached. Spread across the table were a series of photos from the 1994 St. John Festival. In one, Claire was sitting at the chapel's piano playing while the community gathered to sing. In another, William was helping decorate the square with colorful paper flags. Those were the last happy moments before... Claire didn't finish the sentence, but it wasn't necessary. Eleanor picked up another photograph, this one showing William and Claire dancing in the square, completely absorbed in each other, oblivious to the people around them. "We could hold another festival," Eleanor suggested, her eyes shining with that characteristic certainty, "to celebrate the new beginning." "That would be fitting," a voice said from the library door. It was Mrs. Zephyr carrying a basket covered with an embroidered cloth. "The village needs joy again, and I've been keeping this here for a long time, waiting for the right moment." She approached the table and uncovered the basket, revealing dozens of small bells, identical to the ones Eleanor and Claire carried. "It was a tradition," Mrs. Zephyr explained, "to give one of these bells to couples who married in the chapel. The sound was meant to guide them back home, no matter how much time passed. I kept all of these when things changed. But now we can restart the tradition," Eleanor finished, picking up one of the bells and letting it chime softly. The sound seemed to awaken something in the village. Soon others began to appear in the library. Mr. Joseph, leaning on his cane, Richard returning from another trip to Chicago, curious young people who had heard their parents' stories about the couple who defied an empire for love. "We'll need help," William said, looking around at the smiling faces, "to restore not just the chapel, but the entire history of this village. And this time," Claire added, "we'll do it right, as a community." Eleanor moved among the people distributing the bells, her own chiming cheerfully around her neck. Each person who received a bell seemed to carry a piece of the village's history, a fragment of the past that could now be retold without fear or sadness. William watched the scene, amazed at how his life had changed in just a matter of days. The memories that had been stolen from him were back, more vivid and precious than ever. But more important than the recovered memories was the promise of the future that lay ahead. Claire approached, intertwining her fingers with his. "What are you thinking about?" she asked softly. William smiled, watching Eleanor organize a group of children to listen to stories about the village. "I'm thinking that some loves are too strong to be forgotten. They just wait for the right moment to be rediscovered." The sound of bells echoed through the library, each chime carrying promises of new beginnings and old stories finally being told the way they should be, with truth, love, and hope. The morning of the St. John Festival dawned with a different energy in Riverside Village. Colorful banners crisscrossed the streets in every direction, and the aroma of traditional treats already filled the air. From the top of the hill, where the chapel had been fully restored over the past few weeks, the sound of bells mingled with the lively voices of the villagers. William watched the preparations from the window of Mr. Joseph's cafe, which had become his makeshift office. Richard was by his side, finalizing the last documents needed for the official transfer of the chapel to community administration. "I still can't believe we managed to do all this in such a short time," Richard commented, organizing a stack of papers. "That's what happens when an entire community comes together for a common goal," William replied, his eyes following Eleanor, as she ran back and forth, coordinating the children helping with the decorations. The girl had become a sort of mascot for the village, her presence a constant reminder that miracles could happen. Her ability to connect people and stories had built bridges between the past and the present, helping to heal old wounds. "You know what's most amazing?" Richard asked, adjusting his glasses. "How all of this has affected the foundation. Partnership requests from other communities have tripled since we started the restoration project here." William smiled. It was true. The story of Riverside Village had spread, inspiring other communities to seek their own ways of preserving their history and culture. What had begun as a personal journey of redemption had turned into something much greater. "Is Claire at the chapel?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. Richard nodded. "Rehearsing with the choir. It seems like some traditions never really die." William bid his friend farewell and began walking up the path to the chapel. Richard's words echoed in his mind. Traditions, memories, stories that refused to be forgotten, like the sound of the bells that now rang constantly in the village, reminding everyone that some connections were too strong to be broken. As he approached the chapel, he heard the sound of the piano and voices blending into a familiar melody. He stopped at the door, watching Claire at the piano, surrounded by a group of children and adults. Eleanor stood beside her, turning the pages of the sheet music, her bell tinkling softly with each movement. "It's the same song," a voice said beside him. It was Mrs. Celeste, who had become a constant presence in the village since Claire and Eleanor's return. "The same one you danced to that night, 30 years ago." William closed his eyes for a moment, letting the music transport him back. There was no more pain in those memories, just a sweet nostalgia and gratitude for the chance to relive them. "Eleanor told me something interesting yesterday," Mrs. Celeste continued. "She said she always knew she would find you, even before she knew who you were. That in her dreams, she saw a man building bridges, not real bridges, but connections, between people, between the past and the present. She's special," William replied, watching his daughter. "Sometimes I wonder if she came into the world just for this, to reconnect what was broken." The rehearsal ended, and Eleanor was the first to notice his presence. She ran to him with that inexhaustible energy only children possess. "Dad, I need to see what we found in the old chapel archive." She took his hand, pulling him toward the sacristy. Claire followed them, a knowing smile on her lips. In the small room, now organized and restored, Eleanor pointed to an old book on the table. "It's Grandpa Michael's diary," she explained. "He wrote about everything, about when you first arrived, how you met Mom, about the wedding, even about when you left." William picked up the diary with reverent care. The yellowed pages contained not only historical records, but also deep reflections on love, forgiveness, and hope. "He never lost faith," Claire said softly. "Even in the hardest times, Dad always said that one day the truth would find its way back. Like Eleanor found her way to me," William added. "The truth always finds a way," Eleanor said with that wisdom that seemed beyond her years. "It's like the sound of bells. It can echo for a long time, but it always leads people home." Outside, the preparations for the festival continued. The sound of laughter and chatter blended with the ringing of bells, creating a symphony of joy and renewal. The village was alive again, pulsing with old and new stories, all intertwining into a rich tapestry of shared memories. "Shall we go?" Eleanor called, already at the sacristy door. "We still have to rehearse our dance for tonight." William and Claire exchanged amused glances. Their daughter had insisted that they recreate the dance from 30 years ago, not as an attempt to reclaim the past, but as a celebration of the present and a promise for the future. "Yes," William replied, taking Claire's hand. "Let's dance." The St. John Festival transformed Riverside Village into a kaleidoscope of colors, sounds, and emotions. The streets were filled with people, many of them former residents who had returned especially for the occasion. Bonfires crackled at strategic points, illuminating smiling faces and warming hearts with renewed memories. In the central square, where colorful flags danced in the wind, long tables had been arranged in a U-shape, creating a large space in the center for dances and performances. The aroma of traditional dishes mingled with the scent of flowers decorating each table, jasmine, of course, Eleanor's special choice. "It's as if time hasn't passed," Mr. Joseph remarked, sitting in his honorary chair. As the village's oldest resident, he had been chosen to officially open the festivities. "And at the same time, it's as if all the necessary time has passed," Mrs. Zephyr added, adjusting the nearest flower arrangement. In the illuminated chapel, which now stood majestically atop the hill, Claire finished organizing the choir. Voices rose into the night air, rehearsing one last time before the official performance. Eleanor moved among the choristers, distributing sheet music and making last-minute adjustments with surprising efficiency for someone so young. William, dressed in a light suit that closely resembled the one from his wedding day, watched the final preparations with a mix of emotion and gratitude. Richard approached, carrying an envelope. "The final documents," he announced. "Starting tomorrow, the chapel and the cultural center officially belong to the community." "Thank you, Richard," William replied, hugging his friend. "For everything. For standing by me even when you didn't fully understand what was happening." "Hey, what are friends for?" Richard smiled. "Besides, I think we all learned something important here. About truth, about forgiveness, about new beginnings." The sound of a bell cut through the night, not a small bell like the ones everyone now carried, but the large bell of the chapel, restored especially for the occasion. It was the signal everyone had been waiting for. The procession began at the chapel, descending the hill toward the square. Claire led the choir, their voices rising into the night like a prayer of gratitude. Eleanor walked beside her, her bell chiming in harmony with the music. When they reached the square, Mr. Joseph stood up with the help of his cane and delivered a brief speech that touched the hearts of everyone present. "Riverside Village has always been more than a place on the map," he said, his voice filled with emotion. "It's a place where stories intertwine, where the past and the present dance together, where love proves stronger than any obstacle. Today, we celebrate not only our patron saint, but also the return of a story that should never have been interrupted." The festivities officially began with the choir's performance. Claire at the piano, accompanied by the voices of the community, created an almost magical atmosphere. When the music ended, Eleanor stepped onto the small makeshift stage. "Now," she announced in her clear voice, "my parents will recreate a special moment, a dance that began 30 years ago and, in a way, never truly ended." William offered, his hand to Claire, leading her to the center of the square. The music began, the same waltz they had danced to on that distant night. Their bodies moved in perfect sync, as if the years of separation had never existed. "Look," Claire whispered during the dance, indicating with a slight nod of her head. Around them, other couples began to dance, young and old, united by the music and the magic of the moment. Eleanor danced with Richard, laughing as he tried to keep up with her agile steps. The bells chimed softly, creating their own melody that blended with the music. It was as if each bell told a story, of love, of loss, of reunion, of hope. "You know what's most incredible?" William asked Claire as they twirled. "How something that started with so much fear and sadness could turn into so much joy." Claire smiled, that smile he had kept in his heart for 30 years. "It's because true love never really ends. It just waits for the right moment to bloom again." The night progressed with music, dance, and celebration. Stories were shared around the bonfires, old photographs passed from hand to hand, and new bonds were forged on the foundation of restored memories. Eleanor, watching her parents dance once more under the stars, smiled with that ancient wisdom in her young eyes. Her bell chimed softly, as if agreeing with an unspoken thought. Some stories are destined to be eternal, echoing through time like the crystalline sound of a bell, guiding lost hearts back home. The morning after the festival, Riverside Village awoke wrapped in an atmosphere of serenity. The little flags still danced lazily in the morning breeze, and the scent of the bonfires lingered in the air like a sweet reminder of the night before. William found Eleanor sitting on the chapel steps, flipping through Professor Michael's journal. The rising sun painted the sky in shades of pink and orange, creating an almost magical aura around the girl. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, sitting beside his daughter. Eleanor shook her head, her eyes still fixed on the journal's pages. "I was reading about the day Grandpa Michael found out Mom was pregnant." William felt his heart tighten. That was a moment he should have been part of, a joy that had been stolen from him. Eleanor, sensing his emotion, began to read aloud. "Today my Claire told me she's going to be a mother." Her eyes shone with a mix of joy and sadness that broke my heart. "William's child grows in her womb, but he is not here to share this blessing. Yet I see in my daughter's eyes a strength that transcends pain. She told me, 'Dad, this baby is a gift, not just for me, but for all of us.' It's proof that true love leaves seeds that bloom even in the most adverse circumstances." A silent tear rolled down William's face. Eleanor closed the journal and rested her head on her father's shoulder. "He wrote about you every day," she continued. "He kept newspaper clippings, followed your projects through the foundation. He said that one day I'd understand why it was important to know my father, even from a distance. He seemed like an extraordinary man, William remarked. His voice choked. He was, Claire replied, approaching the chapel steps quietly, and he would be very happy to see this moment. She carried with her an old box, the kind used to store photographs. She sat on the other side of Eleanor, creating a perfect circle. I found this morning, while organizing the last things at Dad's house, she explained, opening the box. Inside were dozens of letters, all addressed to William, but never sent. One every week, Claire continued, her voice soft. Dad wrote to you regularly, telling you about Eleanor's growth, about the village, about how things changed and yet stayed the same. He never lost hope that one day these letters would find their way to you. Eleanor picked up one of the letters, her bell jingling with the movement. It was dated the day of her birth. Dear William, today you became a father. Eleanor was born at dawn, bringing with her the promise of a new day. She has your eyes, not just in color, but especially in their sparkle. That same sparkle I saw in you on the first day you arrived in the village, full of dreams and ideals. Eleanor's voice faltered, and William continued reading. Claire chose this name because she says Eleanor will be a light, not just for her, but for everyone who crosses her path. Looking at my granddaughter now, so small and already so special, I know Claire is right. There is something in this child, William, something I can't explain, but I can feel it. It's as if she carries within her not only the love of you, both, but also the wisdom of many generations. He always knew, Eleanor remarked simply. About me, about today, about everything. Claire smiled, running her hand through her daughter's hair. Dad had a gift for seeing beyond appearances, for finding the extraordinary in the ordinary. Just like you, Eleanor. The sun was already high when they finally rose from the chapel steps. The village was beginning to wake, and the first sounds of the day carried the promise of new beginnings. What will we do with the letters? Eleanor asked, helping to store the precious documents back in the box. We'll read them together, William replied. Each one is a piece of our story that needs to be recovered, honored and celebrated. Like a puzzle that has finally found all its pieces, Claire added. Eleanor smiled, her bell jingling in agreement. Do you know what Grandpa Michael wrote? On the last day. She opened the diary to the last page and read, Love is like a bell, its sound can echo through generations, guiding lost hearts back home. And when that sound finds ears ready to listen, miracles happen. The three of them stayed there for a moment longer, watching Riverside Village awaken to another day. The sound of the chapel bells began to ring, calling the faithful to the first. Morning Mass and smaller bells throughout the village responded, creating a symphony of hope and renewal. It was the sound of love finding its way back home. A year had passed since the festival that transformed Riverside Village. The old chapel, now a vibrant cultural center, pulsed with life and activity. The walls that once held secrets now echoed with music, laughter, and shared stories. In the library attached to the center, Eleanor was overseeing her most cherished project, the community's memory archive. Photographs, letters, diaries, and audio recordings formed a living mosaic of local history. Professor Michael's diary held a place of honor alongside the never-sent letters, now digitized and available for future generations to learn about the power of love that had transformed the village. On that special Sunday afternoon, the community gathered for a private celebration. William and Claire, dressed simply yet elegantly, stood before the chapel altar, their hands intertwined just as they had been so many years before. 31. Years ago, Mr. Joseph began, his voice now softer but still carrying that characteristic wisdom, I witnessed the love of these two young people being sealed in this very place. Today we are not here for a new beginning, but to celebrate the continuation of a story that refused to end. Eleanor at the piano began to softly play the same melody her mother used to play. Her musical talent, inherited from Claire, had blossomed over the past year, as had her ability to bring people and stories together. Time, Mr. Joseph continued, is a patient teacher. It teaches us that some bonds are too strong to be broken, that some stories simply need the right moment to be told, and that true love has its own time to bloom. William looked at Claire, seeing in her eyes the same spark that had captivated him 3 decades ago. The past year had been one of discovery, healing and rebuilding, not just of their relationship but of an entire community. The foundation, under his leadership, had truly transformed. The Riverside Village project had become a model for cultural preservation and community development, inspiring similar initiatives in other regions. Claire divided her time between coordinating the cultural center and giving lectures at universities, sharing the extraordinary story of the village's renewal. "You have chosen to renew your vows today," Mr. Joseph went on. "Not to erase the past, but to honor it, to show that every moment, the joyful and the difficult, is part of who you are." Eleanor left the piano and approached, carrying a small wooden box. Inside were 2 special bells, crafted by a local artisan specifically for the occasion. Each bore an engraved phrase from Professor Michael's diary, "Love finds its way." "These bells," Eleanor said, her clear voice filling the chapel, "are different from the others. They were made from the bronze of the chapel's original bell, the one that rang on the day of your first wedding. They carry within them not just the history of our family, but of all of Riverside Village." William and Claire took the bells, their eyes glistening. The sound they made as they rang them together was deep and crystalline, echoing through the chapel walls like a blessing. "And so," Mr. Joseph concluded, "with the blessing of St. Michael, with the witness of this community, and with the love that transcends time, I declare you, once again and forever, husband and wife." The applause and cheers filled the chapel, mingling with the sound of dozens of bells ringing in celebration. Eleanor ran to embrace her parents, forming a perfect circle of love and gratitude. Outside, Riverside Village sparkled under the afternoon sun. The streets that had once witnessed sadness and separation now buzzed with life and hope. The little school where Claire had begun her career as a teacher was full of children once again. Mr. Joseph's cafe remained the community's gathering spot, now with even richer stories to share. Later, during the celebration that followed in the square, William watched Claire and Eleanor dancing together, their bells creating a melody of their own. Richard, who now split his time between Chicago and the village, approached with 2 glasses of champagne. "You know what's most remarkable?" his friend commented, handing one of the glasses to William. "How a story that began with so much pain could turn into something so beautiful." William smiled, his eyes never leaving his family. "It's because some stories are bigger than us, Richard. They belong to time, to love, to life. We just need the courage to let them follow their course." The sound of the bells continued to echo through the village, each chime carrying promises of bright futures and eternal love. It was the sound of truth finding its way, of love conquering time, and of hearts finally at peace with their destiny.